Hello. Welcome to the second bonus lecture of our course on state art and suppressed art, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. Let's get into it. What happens when modern art meets mass politics? That's the big question I want to start with today and that I want to offer as a conversation topic for our bonus discussion session this week. The two films we watched for this particular lecture are remembered primarily as political propaganda, but they are also strangely revered as groundbreaking artworks within film as a medium. And there's an unexpectedly widespread belief in the interwar years that the two elements might go hand in hand, that daring new ideas in the arts might open the doors to mass political movements, a belief that, in different ways, intrigues both dictators and art critics. So that leads us to a second set of questions for this lecture. When does art train our critical faculties as citizens, and when does it indoctrinate us as subjects? This is another way of thinking about the line between art and propaganda in the films that were assigned for this bonus lecture, and these are core questions at the heart of the essay that we read by Walter Benjamin. Here's an outline for what we're going to talk about. The questions take us back to the beginning of our course with the futurist movement of F.T. Marinetti so we can see how the avant-garde intersected with the rise of new political ideologies from that point in 1909 all the way through the 1930s. We're going to go back to that. Then we'll look briefly at how dictators on the rise thought about political art and film in particular to kind of connect the dots from the 1900s to the 1930s. At that point, we'll do a deep dive into Walter Benjamin's essay and try to reconstruct what he has to say about these questions. And finally, we'll arrive at our two films, where we can discuss our own response as an audience once I've given you a little bit of groundwork for the conversation we can have together in person. In week one, we talked a little bit about Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who founded the futurist art movement, created avant-garde collage poems, and advocated for Italy's participation in World War I. It was in this final effort, this advocation, advocacy, I should say, that he became associated with Benito Mussolini, who was also an interventionist. Mussolini admired Marinetti's movement and even said in a letter in 1914 that he himself was, at heart, a futurist. In 1919, Marinetti led some of Mussolini's men on a raid against a socialist newspaper, and reciprocally, Mussolini supported Marinetti as a fascist political candidate. They spoke together at rallies. Marinetti helped write this fascist manifesto that we see here. They were hand in hand. But by the 1920s, a divide started to grow between them. Marinetti's politics were fundamentally anarchist, and he disapproved of Mussolini creating a political pact with the Catholic Church. Mussolini, for his part, relegated futurism to the tastes of early fascism, irrelevant to the reality of politics for an aspiring empire. You can look at some research by Ann Bowler on this topic. And so, even though futurism tried to evolve in the 1920s and 30s to keep up with Mussolini's personality cult, Mussolini gradually pushed the futurists out of politics. On the left here, we see a portrait of Mussolini that celebrates Italy as a modern state with Roman monuments seen from an airplane, but Mussolini came to prefer a return to tradition and classical architecture, as evidenced by this new monument on the right that was built to celebrate Italian heritage. This speaks to one of the inherent paradoxes of fascism as an ideology, that it promises people a glorious future by returning to a glorious past. Mussolini was fond of thinking of his capital as La Terza Roma, or the Third Rome, an empire in the legacy of the ancient Roman Empire and Catholic Rome, not dissimilar to the idea of a Third Reich. But that was a fundamental betrayal for Marinetti of futurism, whose whole platform was the destruction of classicism and tradition. One can tell a similar story about the avant-garde in Russia. The early years of the communist state saw a real flourishing of experimental artworks carrying over avant-garde movements from the 1910s, like constructivism. We talked about this a little bit in week one. These were artists who'd always wanted to revolutionize Russian culture, and they saw the new state as being part of that project. So graphic artists, architects, and filmmakers were using new industrial materials and techniques to support the workers' revolution, as in this poster on the left by El Lissitzky, who hoped to rally the Bolsheviks against dissidents in the Russian Civil War by way of this constructivist abstract art. As in Italy, there was a fairly quick counter-reaction by the actual politicians in power, though. Lenin, as we will see, disapproved of the avant-garde and wanted art that the people could readily understand. This led to a political turn to realism, which under Stalin became the doctrine of socialist realism, art that could still have a galvanizing function, but that was based on naturalistic and figurative representations of people, of the people, I guess I should say, and their leaders. This realist backlash got started as early as 1920, but I'm using this painting from the 40s because it offers a nice contrast to El Lissitzky's poster. Here, the red and the white are probably still symbolic. We see Stalin as the leader of a unified Soviet Union decades later, but the whole of the work is easier to grasp. It doesn't require quite so much understanding of abstract symbols. This is where it might be appropriate to start talking a little bit about the story of Anna Akhmatova and her poem Requiem and how this fits into our particular history. I'm going to plant her just a couple places in this particular lecture before we potentially talk about her poem. So, as a young woman in St. Petersburg, Akhmatova was a leading female figure in a new movement to modernize poetry called Acmeism, kind of similar to Pound's Imagism or Vorticism. She was at the heart of the Russian avant-garde in close association with Osip Mandelstam, Vladimir Mayakovsky, who came up in the Versailles lecture, and a host of other modern writers and artists. Here we see Modigliani's drawing of her from 1911, a drawing that she kept above her fireplace after the wars when all the others were lost. And on the right, a Cubist portrait from 1914. Akhmatova gives her own self-portrait of her early years in part 4 of Requiem retrospectively. If only you'd known, wicked woman, who once cared for nothing but fun, who used to be Petersburg's favorite, that the day will finally come. The ominous tone here clues us into the misery that awaited Akhmatova and her circle after the Russian Revolution. She was unofficially banned from publishing poetry starting in 1925. Her first husband, the poet Nikolai Gumilyov, had been executed by the secret police 4 years before. Her common law husband, the art critic Nikolai Punin, would die in a gulag after his second arrest, and her son, Lev Gumilyov, was imprisoned 4 times starting in 1933, ultimately spending more than a decade in prison camps. It's in this context, waiting outside Kresty prison for a word from her husband and son, that Akhmatova composes Requiem. In 1935, the poet spent some 17 months waiting with other women in queues, hoping to pass a parcel through. And that's where part 4 continues. When, along with 300 others, clutching your parcel, you'll go to wait in line while your tears burn through the New Year's snow. Akhmatova herself may have been protected by Stalin's daughter, or perhaps because she wrote her own praises to Stalin out of desperation. But the project of writing Requiem was truly dangerous. So her process was to write one small piece at a time, then invite one of her trusted friends over to memorize it, and then burn the paper. If she had to revise it, she'd have her friends then memorize the revision. And this would never happen out loud. They would always converse about something else in case they were being listened to. And in that way, for almost 30 years, only about a dozen people knew this poem and carried it around in their heads. So that's how Requiem's Part 4 ends, in silent protest. The poplar tree sways near the prison in silence, but so many lives are ending inside for no reason. The most notorious crackdown on modern art occurred in Nazi Germany. Here, there was never any alignment between the avant-garde and the new political party, but Hitler's life and his vision were much more enmeshed in the arts than Mussolini's or Lenin's were. As we probably all have heard, Hitler applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts as a young man in 1907 and was rejected twice, but that wasn't the end of his artistic aspirations. In fact, from age 18 to 25, he subsisted on painting as a professional, however unsuccessfully. And having been recommended an alternative career in architecture, he produced architectural drawings that would eventually be built as part of his vision for a new Germany. In Mein Kampf, Hitler devotes scores of pages to the arts, arguing that the political collapse of Germany in his generation was equivalent to, quote, the cultural decline, which has been manifested in Cubist and Futurist pictures ever since 1900, unquote. Hitler criticizes modern art as a biological sickness and as the work of Bolshevik agents and of Jews as their proxies. Upon his rise to power in 1933, Hitler dismisses a host of museum officials and art professors, replacing them with his more conservative associates. So this was also, of course, the beginning of book burnings and other anti-intellectual purges. And it's around that time in 1933 that the cartoon on the screen appears, titled The Sculptor of Germany by O.K. Werkmeister. That cartoon shows Hitler destroying a modern artwork by a spectacled artist, caricatured, I think, as Jewish, and erecting in its place a neoclassical Aryan Superman. The cartoon is meant as a political allegory, representing Hitler as a politician smashing the divisions of the Weimar Republic and forming a strong, unified Germany. But it's also a pretty accurate depiction of Hitler's attitude towards the arts, in terms of the kind of art he despised and the kind of art that he promoted. Up until this point, I've been occasionally juxtaposing avant-garde artworks and propaganda in the abstract, so we can compare modern art with state-sanctioned art on our own terms, in the Russian and Italian contexts. But in Germany, in the summer of 1937, Hitler and his ministers organized this juxtaposition themselves by holding two exhibitions in Munich within a few blocks from one another. There was the Great German Art Exhibition, pictured on the right, and the Degenerate Art Exhibition, pictured on the left. The photo I've given you actually comes from a different year, from 1938. Photos from that year are easier to come by. But in any case, they were in the same year in the same place originally. The Degenerate Art Exhibition was thrown together on Hitler's orders with less than a month to prepare, so as to warn artists who fell short of Hitler's expectations for the concurrent Great German Art Exhibition. The wall in the program for the Degenerate Art Exhibition was plastered with quotes by Hitler or approved by the Reich, like the one you see here. The words say, "So they saw the world, the quote unquote masters of degenerate art, praised sky high by Jews and hysterical blatherers." Those were the quote unquote masterpieces, which were paid for with the tax money of the working German people. Sort of sardonic, critical caption for this clutter of avant garde images. Hitler gave his own speech before the opening of the Degenerate show, describing the mop-up war, as he put it, that needed to be waged against this kind of degenerate art, possibly preparing the German audience to apply that same attitude toward the people, Jews, Bolsheviks, other deviants, that the show supposedly represented. In the end, though, some 2 million people came to see the Degenerate show, which was 3 or 4 times as many as went to see the Great German show. And so the Reich Propaganda Directorate decided to take the Degenerate show around the country before, that is, destroying most of the artworks. If you want to get a quick sense of the contrast between the artworks of the two shows, here are the most famous large paintings that hung in each of them. So on the left, we have Otto Dix's The Trench, a grotesque image of the horrors of World War I exhibited in the 1920s as an anti-war statement. And on the right, we have Adolf Ziegler's The Four Elements, an allegorical painting that tries to meld classical beauty with Aryan feminine ideals, and which became one of Hitler's favorite possessions. A lot of the so-called degenerate art was deliberately disturbing, satirical, and critical, whereas the great German art was generally idealistic. In the program that the propaganda ministry put out for the Degenerate exhibition, Otto Dix's painting was presented with the caption, "Painted Sabotage of National Defense," just in case there was any confusion about why this was a dangerous painting. If these dictators couldn't abide modern art, that doesn't mean they were hostile to all novelty in the arts. They were very keen on the possibilities of the new mass media phenomenon that was film. And here's where we turn from conflicts within traditional art forms of painting, sculpture, literature, and architecture to propaganda and propaganda films. At the turn of the 20th century, propaganda was not necessarily a dirty word. The term tended to just mean propagation of information and opinions. The origins there go back to 17th century Catholicism, as it was trying to organize a campaign of true faith against Protestantism as a kind of propaganda. But in any case, as we've seen at the start of World War I, Britain didn't think anything of setting up an explicitly titled War Propaganda Bureau to counter what the Germans were doing, although, of course, the British did keep the existence of this bureau mostly a secret. It's in the aftermath of that war, of the Great War, and in the interwar years that propaganda gains the associations that it has today, thanks to its very close associations with the dictators that we've been talking about. Lenin and Hitler, in particular, are famous theorizers of propaganda. In Lenin's political tract, What Is to Be Done, from 1902, drawing on work from other Marxists, he repeatedly stresses the importance of combining propaganda with agitation, where we get the word agitprop that you may have come across. Here's what Lenin writes. The question arises, what should political education consist in? Can it be confined to the propaganda of working class hostility to the autocracy? Of course not. It is not enough to explain to the workers that they are politically oppressed. Agitation must be conducted with regard to every concrete example of this oppression. That is, if propaganda is just selective information, then agitation is necessary to provoke the audience of that propaganda into action. The Bolsheviks also tended to use propaganda to refer to information circulated among the party, with agitation used for their work more on the people. So that was the early goal of the Bolsheviks in Russia and internationally. This synthesis gave rise to the Soviet Department of Agitation and Propaganda in the 1920s, or agitprop, a term that we associate with a certain kind of political theater that would quickly bleed into film. Lenin reportedly called film the most important of all the arts, and Russian directors became renowned worldwide as experts of film innovation and film theory in the interwar period. Hitler, for his part, takes some time in Mein Kampf to recall how much better British propaganda was than German propaganda during World War I, even explaining the success of the war guilt clause in the Versailles Treaty as a result of this successful British propaganda. So, having learned that lesson, Hitler writes, the art of propaganda consists precisely in being able to awaken the imagination of the public through an appeal to their feelings, in finding the appropriate psychological form that will arrest the attention and appeal to the hearts of the national masses. So, if Lenin's insight is that propaganda has to be designed so as to provoke action, Hitler's insight is that propaganda should work on the audience's emotions and psychology, and that it should be tailored to as broad of an audience as possible. Here are signs of propaganda expanding from a particular program of information about a particular cause to the category of psychological warfare or brainwashing or mass media. In the meantime, though, filmmakers who would one day become these two countries' most famous propagandists were also interested in trying to think theoretically about what film could do as an art form. So Sergei Eisenstein, who was an active essayist in addition to being a filmmaker, broke ground by describing the fundamental technique as that of montage. Cinematography is first and foremost montage, he writes. So montage is conflict. As the basis of every art is conflict, an image is transformation of the dialectical principle. Let me start to unpack this bit by bit, actually. So by montage, Eisenstein didn't mean some kind of entertaining training sequence set to music, the sort of Rocky model that we use to refer to montage now, but rather any sequence of different shots that could have an immediate effect on the audience, making them move, feel, or generate their own associations and ideas. You may remember a few of these kinds of mechanisms within October, the film, right? For instance, Alexander Kerensky and the Gilded Peacock being spliced together. Eisenstein was inspired by Marxist philosophy to think of these shots in conflict with one another. That's where we get this montage as conflict, montage as a dialectical principle. There's this idea in Marx pulled from Hegel that history moves forward according to a dialectic. One idea clashes with its opposite, a thesis and an antithesis, until a synthesis is formed, which then becomes the new thesis generating further progress. Now, here's Eisenstein going forward a little bit more. If the montage is to be compared with something, then a phalanx of montage pieces, of shots, should be compared to the series of explosions of an internal combustion engine driving forward its automobile or tractor. For similarly, the dynamics of montage serve as impulses driving forward the total film. This is how ideas of Marxist philosophy and industrialization influence Eisenstein's theory. Eisenstein's mode of making films is based on political philosophy from the very beginning, regardless of whether it's serving the Communist Party. Eisenstein's most famous early film, Battleship Potemkin, which used a lot of these principles, was an international hit, so much so that Leni Riefenstahl herself remembers it convincing her that films could be works of art. Here's Riefenstahl. During this period, so in Berlin in the 1920s, I saw the film that completely overshadowed all previous films, Sergei M. Eisenstein's Potemkin. When I left the theater, I was dazed. The effect was tremendous, its cast and the photography quite revolutionary. For the first time, I realized a film could be a work of art. I should have also bolded the word revolutionary there. But anyway, for her part, Riefenstahl has a very different approach toward her audience ultimately, and had different goals with what was going to be her artistic techniques. And she describes these in her memoirs when it comes to shooting Triumph of the Will. Riefenstahl writes, I had to work out how to raise the film above a newsreel level. And it wasn't easy to transform speeches, pageants, and so many almost identical events into a motion picture that would not bore the spectators. The only solution I hit upon was to shoot the documentary events in as versatile a manner as possible, with the emphasis on dynamic rather than static tasks. Now, okay, it is important that we take everything Riefenstahl says in her memoirs with a heaping pile of salt, as she tried to characterize Triumph of the Will as a documentary. not, a political propaganda film. But she does have some insight here onto her own filmmaking process, as you would expect. The skill that makes her films exceptional and that add to her legend are the work that she does, specifically planning shots and moving the camera. Riefenstahl used rail tracks, flag poles, and even cameramen on roller skates to make sure her shots were always dynamic. So here we get a bit of a simplified image, but an important one about what divides these two directors and their approach to film. Whereas Eisenstein wants to jolt his viewers with juxtapositions, Riefenstahl is mostly concerned with keeping her viewers enthralled through motion. And whereas Eisenstein's most important work happens in the editing room, creating his montage effects, as he's poring over the film reel here, Riefenstahl's most important work is behind the camera, giving dynamism to her initial shots. So that's why I've picked these two famous photographs of these two directors. We see Eisenstein working with the film strip, ready to make his cuts, ready to make his montage, versus Riefenstahl on a cart, ready to take her moving shot. Okay, so all of this gives us context to take in Walter Benjamin's essay on photography, film, and politics in the 1930s, which is sort of our main event today, in that it's going to teach us a skill of our own. There have already been important political statements on the power of film in the service of propaganda by Lenin, Hitler, and others at this point, before Benjamin is writing. And there has already been some serious theorizing about the possibilities of film as art from Eisenstein and other Soviets. Moreover, the major propaganda films of this age, the ones that combine high artistry with mass political ideology, have already been released. So Eisenstein's October premieres in 1928. Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will premieres in 1935. And now we're going to get this Walter Benjamin essay that comes out around the same time as that Riefenstahl film. Um, okay. As I go into Benjamin's work of art essay, I want to say a few words about what I am up to at this point in the lecture and what the method is that I'm using. So up until this point in the class, we've mostly been reading literary texts, and we've been practicing the skill of close reading, analyzing the form and content of poems and passages from fiction, stuff on the small scale. With a philosophical essay, close reading can certainly be useful, depending on the philosophical writer, but often form is a little less important than the argument itself. So in the humanities, we have a different fundamental tool we apply to this kind of text, which we call the philosophical reconstruction, or reconstructing an argument, wherein one tries to break down a philosophical case into its component parts and figure out how they fit together. And as you know from my announcement on Canvas, you can follow along with this with a handout that I've provided, both in terms of how to use this tool generally and how I'm going to be breaking down Benjamin's essay specifically. But I'm going to kind of go through that beat by beat here in this lecture now. So I'm hoping that this kind of process of argument reconstruction will be especially helpful with Benjamin because he throws a lot of different claims at us. They're not always in a logical or obvious order, and it's not always clear from the essay and its various digressions and case studies and arguments how each claim relates to the next. So I'm going to try to model a reconstruction of the argument here to clarify what is, I acknowledge, a very difficult essay. And then if you read more philosophy or more art criticism in the future, you can hopefully use this method yourself, maybe even if you're inspired to read something like this for your final paper. Okay, we're going to move a little bit fast, but nevertheless try to be thorough here. So one of the most practical things you can do when you are setting out to reconstruct an argument is to decide where the argument ends. What is the author's conclusion? Then we can work backward from there to figure out how he or she got there, what kinds of premises were necessary, what kind of interstitial claims were necessary to arrive at the ending. I don't know if anybody remembers, doing geometry proofs, but I sometimes find that that's kind of an analogy for the sort of project we are up to here. With Benjamin, again, this is difficult, as Benjamin makes a lot of arguments, some more memorable than others, and some buried in the middle, some on either end of the essay. But he does help us out a little bit by laying out some of his goals in the final sentence of the preface, so actually pretty early on. I'm thinking of the quote where he writes, "The concepts which are introduced into the theory of art in what follows differ from the more familiar terms in that they are completely useless for the purposes of fascism. They are, on the other hand, useful for the formulation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art." Okay, so what can we infer from this about his objectives and about his conclusions? Well, parsing this statement, we can say that Benjamin associates fascism with familiar terms in art, whereas he wants to open up new possibilities for those terms and new politics for art. Um, and when Benjamin contrasts fascism against revolutionaries, we already sense something about his own politics, right? Benjamin, like Eisenstein, is heavily influenced by Marx, equates revolution with socialism or with communism. You know, fascist revolution doesn't count. And he'll get into that at the end of the essay as to why it's not a real revolution. And so that's all going to be helpful with the next steps here. But in any case, let's say that the goal of this essay is to introduce new concepts into the theory of art that are useless to fascism but useful to revolutionaries, which is code for communists. Okay, the next thing we need to do in our reconstruction is find the premises of the argument. That is, basic beliefs held by the writer that he will ask us to accept as a starting point so that we can have a basis for the rest of the claims. In Benjamin's case, a core premise running through the essay is the Marxist idea that our social and economic conditions overwhelmingly determine our lives, right down to individual psychology and collective culture. And we can see this at the start of section 3 of the essay when Benjamin hits us with this statement. During long periods of history, the mode of human sense perception changes with humanity's entire mode of existence. We can sum that up in our reconstruction maybe like this. Different historical conditions change our art and our perception of that art. I'm marking this P for premise. Benjamin makes little effort to convince us of this idea. He's pulling it from a whole Marxist tradition and from Marx himself, maybe even from the Communist Manifesto, where Marx gets into a little bit of kind of bourgeois culture and where it originates. And later we may come back to this together when we meet and talk about whether we disagree with this kind of foundational premise. It is going to be very important for the argument that follows. A lot's going to rest on it. But for now, I just want to register it and we'll see what claims follow. We're just going to try to acknowledge the argument as neutrally as possible before we start to think about critiquing it or picking it apart. We want to use what I would call interpretive charity to try to, do our best job of rebuilding the argument on its own terms and see how well it hangs together just from its logical structure. Okay, so what follows from the premise that is claim number one? This is the thing that sets the whole essay in motion. We gotta find the claims that follow. Benjamin is now going to take us through the history of art to show us how historical conditions indeed have affected culture. So there is a maybe backward way that he is trying to prove the initial statement by giving us a little bit of art history and a little bit of cultural and economic history. So we might move ahead by looking at one of Benjamin's statements about art at the beginning of history. When he claims, we know that the earliest works of art originated in the service of a ritual, first the magical, then the religious kind. It is significant that the existence of the work of art with reference to its aura is never entirely separated from its ritual function. What Benjamin is claiming is that ancient artworks, sculptures of deities, temples, poems of praise, likely served a religious function, which means that we ascribe importance to particular unique artworks in holy places, to the point that one might even take a pilgrimage to pray in front of a certain statue or within a certain building, right? And this concern with the authenticity of a unique, powerful art object is what Benjamin calls aura. That's going to be one of the most important terms that comes out of this essay. And you can see how even in our time, Benjamin has a point here. We make pilgrimages to specific museums to see specific artworks all the time, even when we have high resolution or three-dimensional photos available. Even if the Mona Lisa, for instance, is not a religious object, people go to see it as a kind of a ritual, as the original painting still has a kind of aura. So we're ready to add to our reconstruction and say, historically, art served a ritual or cult function, which imbued unique artworks with an aura. And that history may start with prehistory, but it goes up until pretty recent memory, if not even continuing into the present day. So I'm starting to track in the parentheses after each of these claims, how the claims relate to one another. So at the end of claim 2, I'm going to say that it's depending a little bit on claim 1 or premise 1, right? That this idea of history and culture being inextricably linked is part of what allows Benjamin to make this case. But you could flip the order. You could say that actually this is the evidence for what Benjamin is arguing about historical conditions. Maybe that's valid too. Okay, the big theme of Benjamin's essay comes in here. What happens when artworks are no longer unique? What happens when they can be mechanically reproduced? We get that historical analysis at the end of section 4. With the advent of the first truly revolutionary means of reproduction, Benjamin writes, so photography, simultaneously with the rise of socialism. Okay, there's something going on about historical coincidence here that Benjamin thinks is more than coincidence. Art sensed the approaching crisis. At the time, art reacted with the doctrine of l'art pour l'art, of art for art's sake, that is, with a theology of art. However, for the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, that is politics. Okay, so this is really important. So let's break it all down. First of all, Benjamin notes the convergence of mass media with mass politics, right? Photography, socialism. For him, based on premise one, these phenomena are connected. Second, he observes that in the 19th century, not all artists are keen to use this new photograph technology. On the contrary, many dig in their heels and try to create a new religion or theology around art. He's trying to make the claim, he's trying to make sense of the fact that photography and the art for art's sake movement appear for around the same time. So again, that doesn't feel like a historical coincidence for him. And so he claims that one is a reaction to the other. So finally, Benjamin observes that there is another solution to this crisis. For some artists, if the idea of ritual and aura has been demolished by photography, they should look elsewhere for a function for their art. With socialism on the rise, artists find that function in politics. So that gives us our third claim in the reconstruction, that photography has created a crisis and perhaps a fork in the road. Some artists retreated to the power of ritual, while others turned to the power of politics. These were kind of your options in the 19th century with the advent of this technology and the advent of this new political movement. Okay, pause here to bring Akhmatova in again and Eisenstein in again as illustrations. All right, I want to illustrate Benjamin's idea of aura and the theology of art by using a religious icon, a representation of Our Lady of Pokrov, i.e., Madonna of the Veil, a Ukrainian image of protection. So while there are many images of Mary in this kind of pose, each one is unique. And when Ukrainians have been looking for hope under various invasions and occupations, or when they've been celebrating the feast day of this particular Mary, they can go contemplate and pray to a particular icon. As this one is in the National Art Museum of Ukraine. And Gillian Porter, in an article called "Commemorative Cues" on Lenin and Eisenstein and Akhmatova, points out that Sergei Eisenstein and Anna Akhmatova both seem to reference this particular image in their work. Or at least something quite like it. So in October, the film, when depicting the women who queued for bread and sparked the February Revolution of 1917, Eisenstein focuses on a silhouette of a woman in a shawl. And then in Requiem, in Akhmatova's poem, the poet reflects on how her work is to preserve the transmissions of hushed voices in the same way her poem would be preserved. And she writes it like this. Once more, the hour of remembrance draws near, and it's almost as though I can see them all here, the one who queued to the point of collapse, and the one whose time on this earth has now passed, and the one who, shaking her head, used to groan, when I enter this place, it's like coming back home, and I would have recorded you all in my verse, but they've taken the list where your names were preserved. So instead, I've made you a shawl out of words, saved from the talk which I once overheard. So Benjamin might point to the difference between what Akhmatova and Eisenstein are doing as the split between art for art's sake and art for politics, right? So one way of kind of illustrating the divergence that Benjamin notices in the 19th century and thinks continues into the 20th century is that maybe a poet like Akhmatova, who is more of a kind of pure aristocratic artist, is trying to play with motifs of herself and the poet as Mary, or maybe now even as a kind of Penelope, someone who endures and preserves as a solitary, elevated poetic heroine. Whereas Eisenstein likes the anonymity of using a movie extra amid a crowd that he's shooting to stir a certain kind of identification with the audience. So, are you putting on the shawl because you're comparing yourself to one of the great cultural traditional heroines, to Mary, perhaps to Penelope as a weaver, because you are elevating yourself and elevating the importance of this individual artwork and you as a poet, as Akhmatova is perhaps doing? Or are you interested in trying to mobilize some kind of class consciousness by having this ordinary person who is anonymous, not an actress, just an extra who happens to be taking on this pose and wearing this sort of totem, because it allows you to feel as an audience member that you could belong in this crowd and partake in the February Revolution. But perhaps that division that I've established here oversimplifies things, right? Maybe there is still something like aura in film, conversely, or maybe there are still politics in lyric poetry, right? Um, Eisenstein is, after all, reenacting the revolutions of 1917, which feels a little bit like, performing a kind of ritual for the people, a kind of going back to a particular moment in recent history. Whereas, for Akhmatova, on the other hand, transmitting voices in her kind of secret, illegal poetry is a new act of resistance, maybe even one that's like the women gathering in bread queues. And there's a suggestion here that by playing the religious analogy all the way through to crucifixion and what Mary is mourning, maybe a resurrection is at hand. Maybe there's some kind of hope for a new reform or new revolution or new rebirth in Russia that Akhmatova is advocating for. So there is certainly a kind of theology of art at play in Eisenstein and a kind of radical artistry in Akhmatova. So it is helpful to kind of see the divisions that Benjamin would establish for us and maybe sort artists into those camps at times, but we should always complicate that picture. Okay. Anyway, um, if we were all in person here, I'd be wanting to gauge your own reactions to, these passages and images, because now we're going to talk about audience. We're going to talk about how Benjamin is taking these early arguments and reflecting on what all this does to those of us who consume in one form or another art. And in typical fashion, he's going to try to situate this in economic terms. Okay, here's what Benjamin says. In the decline of middle class society, contemplation becomes a school for asocial behavior. It was countered by distraction as a variant of social conduct. Dadaistic activities actually assured a rather vehement distraction by making works of art the center of scandal. One requirement was foremost, to outrage the public. Okay, again, some parsing is needed here, but I think what Benjamin is saying is this, that in his time, economic conditions have separated society into two camps. Again, Marx is running through this, right? Wealthy art connoisseurs associated with the bourgeoisie, the sort of owning class, and on the other side of things, the general public. Much like our time, this is a period marked by anxieties about a disappearing middle class, about an oligarchy and the 99%, perhaps. The elites were interested in the old functions of art. They wanted to participate in the old rituals around artistic aura. So now the bourgeoisie is kind of like, taking over what used to be the realm of the aristocracy, perhaps. They continue to appreciate art as an act of solitary contemplation. The masses, on the other hand, Benjamin argues, and he's looking out at, interwar Europe to make this case, are drawn to artistic stunts, the kinds of scandals that only last for a moment but excite a lot of people at once. And the avant-garde, including the futurists and the Dadaists, in spite of their different politics, with their manifestos and their obscenities, are really good at rallying big crowds around these kinds of artistic scandals. Benjamin gives us another account of this on the next page when he writes, "A man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed in it. In contrast, the distracted mass absorbs the work of art." In other words, if you as an individual genuflect before a work of art as part of a ritual, you let it have a kind of power over you. But if you as a group merely take in new artworks as distractions, you can use them as you go along your way any way you want. This is a kind of, this is where the argument gets a little bit murky for folks, and I think it'll be fun to talk about together, specifically with regard to, which is film one of these or the other? Is film the kind of work that absorbs you, or is film the kind of work that you absorb? We're getting to that in a moment. Okay, but let's sum up this insight. So Benjamin would say, today's divide accordingly separates two kinds of spectators: individuals absorbed in contemplation and masses who absorb art as a distraction. All right, I'm shrinking down the claims so we can make room for some new ones. As I said, because Benjamin has this sense of a historical trajectory, he thinks that all this modern art, Dada, Surrealism, Futurism, is the prelude to film. We are continuing to think in terms of progress. But whereas the masses are scandalized by an avant-garde stunt, they enjoy a new film. Benjamin compares the quote unquote reactionary attitude that audiences have to a Picasso painting against the progressive attitude that they have to a Chaplin movie. Mechanical reproduction of art, he writes, changes the reaction of the masses toward art. The progressive reaction is characterized by the direct, intimate fusion of visual and emotional enjoyment with the orientation of the expert. So he makes a few sub arguments for this that film audiences identify with the position of the camera, and that it's easier for the masses to be armchair critics of film spectacles that have been created for them, and that we now live in an age where more and more people participate in a culture of expressing themselves. This all, actually feels really appropriate and for our time, and feels like we need a new essay on the work of art in the age of social media or what have you. But toward the end of the essay, Benjamin why explains why it matters for this particular period, for his particular period, why it matters that film can make use of these mass experts, as it were. He writes, the film makes the cult value recede into the background, not only by putting the public in the position of the critic, but also by the fact that at the movies, this position requires no attention. The public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. Because the masses can use the film to think critically, that is, without praising the film as a cult object of aura, the way they might approach a famous painting, according to Benjamin, film is the ideal medium to both empower and mobilize the crowd. So, in other words, here's the claim. When the film arrives, or sorry, when film as a genre, as a medium arrives, it mobilizes the mass audience without absorbing it. The masses are both informed examiners and distracted enjoyers. So again, now we're deepening into what makes Benjamin's argument really, truly unique and unusual, and maybe what might make it dubious for you, but perhaps interesting. And I think we can talk about this a little bit together. This idea of two different ways to appreciate art, of being absorbed by it or absorbing it for your own purposes, and where film fits in here. But I'll say, like one important bit of context here is that Benjamin is pals with Bertolt Brecht, and also the two of them together are theorizing what theater is supposed to do in this particular era, where Brecht wants to get away from a Wagnerian model of turning off the lights and lighting only the stage and having, crowds be absorbed in operas about ancient myth, and instead, give them plays that are very thinly veiled parables or allegories, if indeed they are that at all, to inspire kind of political resentment, political action, political awakening, in a brightly lit theater space where the audiences are encouraged to yell at the stage and talk to one another, and maybe hold up placards or maybe even get into brawls. These are all things that Brecht is excited about. And I think Benjamin, when he looks at the movie halls of his time, and thinks about the ways in which crowds don't feel they have to revere this new form. They feel like they are sufficient experts to be critics of this new form, by nature of going to a lot of these. Are kind of maybe able to experience film the way that Brecht wants people to experience theater. A little bit distracted, kind of talking to your neighbor, kind of constantly evaluating, but also, not necessarily letting yourself get lost in it. And that's different, from going to an AMC theaters for us, where it is more the Wagnerian experience. But maybe that just speaks to what a movie hall might have been like in his own time, or might have been like aspirationally. Okay. So this takes us, sorry, did I? Yeah, this takes us to the epilogue of the essay. And that's the most famous part of Benjamin's argument, because here he brings matters back to the politics of the 1930s. The best known quote is in the first paragraph of that epilogue. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life, or the aestheticization of politics. The violation of the masses, whom fascism with its Führer cult forces to their knees, has its counterpart in the violation of an apparatus which is pressed into the production of ritual values. So the phrase that everyone has taken away from this paragraph is the introduction of aesthetics into political life, usually translated as the aestheticization of politics. Here, Benjamin is noticing the pageantry, spectacle, design, and propaganda that makes fascism and Nazism so appealing to their followers. But the next few lines are also really important in the context of where that phrase pops up, because this is where the argument connects to the rest of the essay. Benjamin is noticing that fascism uses old, traditional power that art used to have. It restores art's role in the service of cult and ritual. Fascism is all about the cult of the leader and the rituals of the party, and it perversely uses new art technologies toward those old ends. Notice the phrase, quote, violation of an apparatus which is pressed into the production of ritual values. Here, what Benjamin is saying is that film and photography have this possibility to be used for revolutionary ends, but instead are being used for reactionary ends in this particular political context. Benjamin makes that even clearer in the last paragraph when he writes, Fiat ars pereat mundus, let art be created though the world perish, says fascism. And as Marinetti admits, expects war to supply the artistic gratification of a sense perception that has been changed by technology. This is evidently the consummation of art for art's sake. Fascism is the continuation of the turn that some artists took toward ritual and toward contemplation rather than the turn toward revolution. This is a different way of trying to bridge the divide that was created in the last century around claims 3 and 4, not by letting the masses absorb new ideas, but by having them absorbed into cults and rituals. As Benjamin puts it, they express themselves only in the rituals of the party and imagine their own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure. So the claim, fascism uses cult and ritual to absorb the masses, and it puts film to the same ends, that is, the aestheticization of politics. And then in the last line of the essay, we get this cryptic final rejoinder. Communism responds by politicizing art. In isolation, this final line can drive you a little bit crazy. Like, what does this actually mean? Doesn't this need its own chapter, Walter Benjamin? But if you trace the arguments that Benjamin has been making, you realize that he has been building his case for this final sentence all along. So if we turn back a few pages, for instance, we get this helpful passage. For the tasks which face the human apparatus of perception at the turning points of history cannot be solved by contemplation alone. Since, moreover, individuals are tempted to avoid such tasks, art will tackle the most difficult and most important ones where it is able to mobilize the masses. Today, it does so in the film. Here is where Benjamin sets up the ending. He's making the case that films, which empower audiences as casual experts without absorbing them in acts of genuflection or contemplation, are tools or should be tools for the masses to use. The right kinds of films will help audiences acquire habits of thinking about their historical circumstances with a crowd that will help lead them to a revolution. So here's my attempt at forming that into a final claim for the Reconstruction. Communism responds to fascism with political films that the masses can absorb for themselves, mobilizing them to take action and take power, thereby politicizing art, the opposite of aestheticizing politics. Okay, so now you can hopefully see how the final points in the epilogue match up with Benjamin's stated goals in the preface, right? He acknowledges that fascism has its own theory of art based in ritual or cult functions, but he wants to steer revolutionary artists in a new direction toward art that will destroy aura and that masses can absorb to become more politically conscious. Up to this point, I haven't been trying to evaluate Benjamin's claims too much. I've just been trying to reconstruct them. But now that they're laid out, I think it's fair to think a little bit about how this argument stacks up. We might notice using some arrows, perhaps, where there are particular weight-bearing claims in this argument. Often it's most interesting if those claims come in the middle. Here, that there are a few of those, but I would start by just pointing to premise one, right? That claim about historical conditions and how they change our perception of art and culture clearly is the basis for so much of the rest of this argument. So maybe we have to go back to Marx and see, how we feel about that premise, and see Marx's own arguments for it. If Benjamin's just taking it for granted here, right? If we want to evaluate that. Another important element of the essay, for me, I think, is this sort of middle section of claims 3 and 4, where Benjamin tries to explain what's so important about the advent of photography and eventually the advent of film. Does it indeed create this division? How does that division reflect itself in political, ideological divisions of the 20th century and the art thereof? Is it really true that there are two kinds of spectators, a bourgeois individual who lets himself be absorbed in contemplation of artworks with aura, and masses, on the other hand, who absorb art themselves and are able to kind of reform their ideas rather than give themselves over to the artwork? Is that really what happens in the 19th century? Is that really what happens with photography? Is that true of film? These are the things maybe to ponder and maybe to think about more specifically with regard to the two films that we have as case studies. So we'll get into all of that when we meet. But let's talk a little bit more about those two films just to kind of lay some groundwork for that conversation. A bit of background. on how Benjamin's argument might apply to these two movies. Benjamin probably never saw Riefenstahl's film. It wouldn't have made it to him in Paris in 1937, where he was at that time, or sorry, until 1937, I should say. And he already started writing the essay at that point. But he had seen some of Eisenstein's early work. While visiting Moscow, he had seen Battleship Potemkin, and he wrote an essay in 1927 where he compared Russian and German film earlier on. Benjamin described the cinema of the Russian Revolution as a superior tier, up high. This is a kind of funny bit of praise, up high with American slapstick comedy. So Benjamin says that Eisenstein and the Russians had managed to put mass movement on film and writes, no other medium could reproduce this collective emotion. Ever since Potemkin, such scenes have become the undying possession of Russian film art. Um, Eisenstein's October appeared the year after that particular Benjamin essay. It was commissioned by the state for the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, and it attempts to recreate that revolution on film. The filming took over Leningrad or St. Petersburg for 6 months. And one of the remarkable things about Eisenstein's process, which Benjamin noticed when he was in Russia, is that he used common people rather than seasoned actors for most of his roles. In that respect, this was something like a participatory reenactment as much as a film set. But Eisenstein also engaged in some dramatic embellishments. Eisenstein's film exaggerates the scale and violence of the storming of the Winter Palace with thousands of rebels instead of about 100. Some even say that Eisenstein's reenactment caused more casualties and more damage to the Winter Palace than the revolution itself. Nearly 50,000 meters of film were shot, of which 2,000 meters were used in the final cut. Eisenstein consciously used October to experiment with his so-called intellectual or ideological montage. I'll include some slides at the end about that if you're curious about the different tiers of montage that Eisenstein theorizes. But he was not completely independent as an artist. Stalin intervened in the editing room, demanding that Eisenstein cut out scenes involving Trotsky. Foreign critics who had been champions of Battleship Potemkin, like Siegfried Kracauer, identified this new film as propaganda, where they maybe would have, assessed Potemkin on more artistic terms. And Stalinists within Russia attacked Eisenstein for his, conversely, for his formalist excess, for trying to be too artsy with what he was up to. So there are two important aspects of Eisenstein's craft that I think Benjamin would have picked up on as relating to the film's political goals. First, Benjamin took special note of the fact that Eisenstein used regular people to act out participating in the revolution, right? I mentioned that already. So here from the essay, we see Benjamin writing, some of the players whom we meet in Russian films are not actors in our sense, but people who portray themselves. That's significant. Second, Benjamin thought that the editing of the film itself could inspire its audience to imagine such action. Our factories appeared to have us locked up hopelessly. Then came the film and burst this prison world asunder by the dynamite of the tenth of a second, so that now in the midst of its far-flung ruins and debris, we calmly and adventurously go traveling. So if Eisenstein's goal was not just to commemorate the Russian Revolution, but to create a new international smash hit that might inspire other revolutions, and indeed the film was distributed as such, his crowd of everyman extras and his montages of toppling statues seem to make new political possibilities come to life, or at least that's kind of how what Benjamin might say about it. Now, one could say very similar things about some elements of Riefenstahl's film. After all, this is also a movie full of crowds of ordinary people in which impressionable Germans could potentially identify themselves. The first key difference, though, is that Riefenstahl's film is not a reenactment. It is footage of an actual rally. Hitler had personally asked Riefenstahl to make a film documenting a party rally in 1933, based on Riefenstahl's early film work romanticizing German mountain life and dramatizing fairy tales. And so in that year, Riefenstahl made her first film at a Nuremberg rally titled Victory of Faith, but copies of it were purged after the essay leader Ernst Röhm, who'd had a big part in the film, was killed in the Night of the Long Knives. So Triumph of the Will is a second attempt with a little bit of a rehearsal, a little bit of practice. And this time the rally was designed ahead of time to actually accommodate the film, with help from Hitler's chief architect, Albert Speer. So this is why, this idea of it just being merely a documentary is pretty dubious. And the line blurred between, Eisenstein's reenactment and Hitler and Riefenstahl's theater it's not as solid of a line as you might think. So as with Eisenstein's film, the production operated on a massive scale here. Riefenstahl had a crew of nearly 200 people and shot more than 60 hours of film. And it's in the editing that we get a more substantial difference. between October and Triumph in the editing room. So most importantly, through her editing, Riefenstahl gives us a different account of the mass's relation to the leader. Lenin plays a relatively small role in October compared to the importance of the Russian masses. But Triumph of the Will cuts back and forth between Hitler and his followers, but before focusing on Hitler ultimately as a speaker and a leader. And so I think what Benjamin would notice in particular is how the Hitler cult is practically a religion, full of the rituals that one associates with older forms of worship. He descends from the sky in an airplane. The rally is held in front of a Gothic church in Nuremberg, and followers gather around to hear him speak. One of the most striking rituals, in fact, is the use of a blood flag pictured on the right. This was a swastika flag that had been present at the failed coup in Munich in 1923, the beer hall putsch, which now carried the blood of a brown shirt who died. So, in Benjamin's terms, that particular flag has a unique aura for the Nazis, perhaps. And as part of the rally, Hitler goes down the line of the current standard bearers to touch their swastika banners with the blood flag and thereby consecrate them as a kind of perverse sacrament. Everything Benjamin says about film freeing art from aura, ritual, and cult is negated in a scene like that. On the contrary, Riefenstahl uses film to bring us back to all of those traditions. So, for Benjamin's perspective, we might look at a line where he doesn't seem to be writing about film at all, but rather about ritual. When he writes, this ritualistic basis, however remote, is still recognizable even in the most profane forms of the cult of beauty. He could have in mind a scene like this. Um, or we might recall some of his words from the epilogue, where he does turn more specifically to fascism and writes, all efforts to render politics aesthetic culminate in one thing, and that is war. This film is, after all, predominantly a display of Germany's return to some kind of military strength. It is important to note that the Triumph of the Will does not prominently feature the Wehrmacht, the Wehrmacht, the German army. The uniformed men here belong to the SA and the SS, but they are meant to look like an army, and I think perhaps to convince the army to get behind the party next. If I can leave everyone, now that I'm coming here to the end of the lecture and to the 1 hour mark, with something to chew on before we meet together in person, for those of you who want to talk about these films, um, it's from the other ending of Benjamin's essay. So kind of like I did with Eliot and taking us to the notes, I want to take us to Benjamin's notes and to his final footnote, where he writes this. One technical feature is significant here, especially with regard to newsreels, the propagandist importance of which can hardly be overestimated. Mass reproduction is aided especially by the reproduction of the masses. In big parades and monster rallies, in sports events, and in war, all of which nowadays are captured by camera and sound recording, the masses are brought face to face with themselves. So the question that Benjamin is fundamentally wrestling with, and that we can debate together, is this. What is the more likely outcome of this encounter, of a movie theater crowd encountering a crowd on the screen? Is it more likely, as Benjamin hopes, that the theater audience will remain critical and distracted, resistant to being absorbed, making use of the films to their own advantage, awakening to a kind of political consciousness of their own class? Or is it more likely, as we have come to fear with propaganda, that the theater audience will be absorbed, indoctrinated into an ideology that takes them and sweeps them along? All right, I'll let you ponder that. Maybe that's the question we'll start with when we meet up together. We will end there. But there are some more slides in this lecture that I'm going to upload and that you can look at, including a little bit more of Anna Akhmachova's Requiem and her call for a statue to be built in commemoration of the waiting that she did outside the prison. And that statue was indeed built in, that monument was indeed built in 2006. So there's that to think about. There's maybe some specific comparisons of different scenes of the two films that we can talk about. And if you're curious, there is a breakdown of all the different forms of montage that Eisenstein theorized. And you can try to identify some of these in your watching or rewatching of October. But of course, our main event will be talking about Spain for the remainder of that lecture in week 4. All right, I'm looking forward to all of that and to seeing you all around these fascinating texts, films, and artworks. So until then, I'll sign off.